Have you ever woken up at 2 a.m., made your way to the bathroom half asleep, and wondered why this keeps happening night after night? If you're getting up once, twice, or even 3 times a night to urinate, you are far from alone. But here's what almost nobody tells you. This isn't always a bladder problem, and it's definitely not always about how much water you drank before bed. In the next few minutes, we're going to walk through what's really happening inside your body at night, why your legs might be secretly working against you while you sleep, and what tests can uncover a root cause that most doctors never think to check for. Stick around, because the third factor we cover is one that even many physicians overlook. Let's start with something surprising. Most adults produce somewhere between 1 and 2 cups of urine overnight. That number holds fairly steady across healthy people. But where does that fluid actually come from? A lot of people assume it's simply the glass of water they had right before bed. In reality, a large portion of that overnight fluid was consumed hours earlier, sometimes as early as lunchtime. Your body doesn't process fluid on a strict schedule tied to when you drink it. Instead, fluid can sit in your tissues for hours before it eventually makes its way back into your bloodstream and then to your kidneys. This is one reason why simply cutting off water an hour before bed doesn't fix the problem for a lot of people. If the fluid causing your nighttime bathroom trips was consumed at breakfast or lunch, restricting your evening intake barely touches the actual source. Now here's a number that puts this in perspective. By the time people reach their 80s, the vast majority are getting up at least once a night to urinate. This has become so common that many people, and unfortunately many doctors, treat it as simply an unavoidable part of aging. But common does not mean normal, and it definitely does not mean harmless. Frequent nighttime urination is linked to poor sleep quality, increased risk of falls, and even cardiovascular strain over time. It deserves real investigation, not a shrug. So if it's not just about how much you drink, what else could be driving this? One of the most overlooked contributors is fluid retention, and it's more connected to your metabolism than most people realize. When we hear the phrase fluid retention, we usually think of salt. Eat too much sodium, retain water, simple as that. But mounting research points to something else as an equally powerful driver: elevated glucose and insulin levels. Here's the connection. When insulin levels are chronically elevated, which happens in a condition called insulin resistance, your kidneys respond by holding onto more sodium than they should. And where sodium goes, water follows. This means your body can retain fluid even if your salt intake looks perfectly normal on paper. Some researchers have gone so far as to say that in certain cases, low salt intake can actually trigger the body to release more insulin to compensate, creating a strange feedback loop where salt restriction alone doesn't solve the retention problem. There's another layer to this. At night, insulin is supposed to drop to its lowest levels of the day. That's part of your body's natural rhythm. But in someone with insulin resistance, that nighttime dip doesn't happen properly. Insulin stays elevated when it shouldn't be. And elevated insulin at night has been associated with increased activity in the part of your nervous system responsible for the fight-or-flight response. That heightened nervous system activity can actually cause the bladder to feel more pressure and can be part of what nudges you awake in the first place, sometimes before you even consciously feel the urge to go. Large population studies have found a fairly consistent pattern here. Researchers analyzing health survey data spanning over a decade found a clear, straight-line relationship between insulin resistance scores and how often people reported nighttime urination. The higher someone's insulin resistance, the more likely they were to report frequent nighttime bathroom trips. This pattern held up across different age groups, different body types, and different demographic backgrounds. In other words, this isn't a fluke limited to one small group of people. It shows up broadly. So if insulin and glucose might be playing a hidden role, how would you actually know if this applies to you? This is where 2 simple tests come in, and both are things you can ask your doctor about directly. The first is an edema check. Edema is simply the medical term for fluid retention, and it often shows up in the lower legs and ankles first, since gravity pulls fluid downward throughout the day. A doctor can check for this in seconds by pressing gently on the shin bone area. If a visible indentation remains for a few seconds after the pressure is released, that's a classic sign of fluid retention. If you notice your socks leaving deep marks on your ankles by the end of the day, or your shoes feeling tighter in the evening than in the morning, that's a strong hint the same thing is happening. The second test is a fasting insulin test. This is different from a standard blood glucose test, and it's honestly underused in routine checkups. A fasting glucose test can come back completely normal for years before insulin resistance becomes obvious on paper. That's because your pancreas compensates by producing more and more insulin to keep glucose levels looking fine, sometimes for a decade or longer, before glucose numbers start creeping up. A fasting insulin test catches the problem at that earlier, quieter stage, well before it progresses into full prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. If you've been dealing with unexplained nighttime urination and your regular blood sugar numbers look fine, this is the test that might actually reveal what's going on underneath the surface. Now let's talk about that gravity piece, because it ties everything together in a way that finally makes sense of why this specifically happens at night. Throughout the day, especially if you're sitting for long stretches, standing for long shifts, or dealing with any degree of poor circulation, fluid tends to pool in your lower legs. Blood vessels aren't perfectly efficient at pushing that fluid back upward against gravity, so some of it seeps into the surrounding tissue instead. This is why your ankles might look a little puffier by evening compared to first thing in the morning. Here's what happens next. When you lie down to sleep, gravity is no longer working against that fluid. Instead of being trapped in your legs, it has a much easier path back into your bloodstream. Your circulatory system picks it up, sends it through your kidneys, and your kidneys, doing exactly what they're supposed to do, filter it out as urine. This is a big part of why nighttime urine production can be so much higher than daytime production for some people, even when their total daily fluid intake hasn't changed at all. This mechanism becomes especially relevant for people with conditions that affect circulation, including vein problems in the legs, certain heart conditions, and even prolonged sitting from desk jobs or long commutes. If you suspect this applies to you, wearing compression socks during the day, elevating your legs periodically, and moving around instead of sitting for hours at a stretch can meaningfully reduce how much fluid accumulates in your legs in the first place. Less fluid pooled during the day generally means less redistributed fluid overnight. There are two more pieces of this puzzle worth mentioning because they're common and frequently missed. The first is sleep apnea. This is a condition where breathing repeatedly stops and starts during sleep, and it's far more common than most people assume, especially in people who snore heavily or who carry extra weight around the neck and midsection. Sleep apnea puts unusual pressure on the heart and chest during those breathing pauses, and this can trigger the release of a hormone that increases urine production. People with undiagnosed sleep apnea often report multiple nighttime bathroom trips as one of their main symptoms, right alongside daytime fatigue and morning headaches. If you snore loudly, wake up gasping, or feel exhausted no matter how many hours you sleep, it's worth bringing this up with a doctor, since a formal sleep study can identify it clearly. The second overlooked factor is medication timing. Certain blood pressure medications, in particular a category known as diuretics, are designed specifically to help your body release excess fluid. If one of these is taken in the evening rather than the morning, it can directly cause more nighttime urination simply because of when it's active in your system. This is not something to change on your own, but it is absolutely worth a conversation with your prescribing doctor, since sometimes a simple timing adjustment earlier in the day can make a noticeable difference without changing the medication itself. So let's bring this all together. If you're waking up multiple times a night to urinate, the fix isn't automatically drinking less water in the evening, although that can help at the margins. The deeper question is what's happening with your fluid balance throughout the entire day, and whether glucose and insulin are quietly playing a bigger role than you'd expect. An edema check can show you whether fluid retention is happening in the first place. A fasting insulin test can reveal whether elevated insulin is part of what's driving that retention, often years before a standard blood sugar test would catch anything unusual. And understanding the role of gravity explains why fluid that built up in your legs during the day comes back to find you right when you're trying to sleep. None of this is meant to replace a conversation with your doctor. If nighttime urination is a regular part of your life, please bring this up at your next appointment, mention the edema check and the fasting insulin test by name, and ask whether sleep apnea or medication timing could be contributing as well. These are simple, low-cost steps that can uncover a root cause that's often hiding in plain sight. If you found this helpful, let me know in the comments whether you've ever had a fasting insulin test done, and subscribe if you want more videos that dig past the surface-level explanations most health content stops at. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.